got everyone here. All the committee members are here. Caitlin's here, so I think we're good to go. So welcome everyone to Caitlin Brett's thesis defense. So first of all, many of you have probably been to a thesis defense before. This is for the agricultural environmental AESS master's program. And so the rules of this defense will be, Caitlin will give her presentation. After she's finished with her presentation, there'll be time for the audience to ask any questions they may have regarding her thesis. And then we'll ask the audience to leave. And then Caitlin will get further questions from her committee involving specifics of her thesis. So a little bit about Caitlin. She came to UTRGV in September 2020, right during COVID. So we've got a whole cohort of what I like to call COVID kids coming through to survive the rigors of COVID and the concept of Zoom and all the associated remote learning that goes along with that. While she's been here, she was a graduate research assistant where she worked on a large project we have ongoing on 2 roads revolving around mitigation to prevent the mortality of the endangered ocelot. Along with that come a lot of other associated species using these underpasses and fenced areas and even the right-of-way that Caitlin will tell you about. So while here, she also participated in several other things. She was an animal husbandry volunteer at the Gladys Porter Zoo Herpetarium. She volunteered with mist netting and data collection for avian ecology research, and also volunteered with white-tailed deer capture and collection at Texas A&M Kingsville. She's presented her research at the International Conference on Ecology and Transportation, and also at the Texas chapter of the Wildlife Society. And before coming here, she graduated from The Ohio State University with a degree in landscape architecture. She was a professional landscape planner in Columbus, Ohio. She also worked at North Dakota State University, their extension centers as a wildlife research technician, and also at the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies as a survey technician. I'd like to also announce she's just been accepted a new job after this with North Carolina State University, and she'll also be working with Mississippi State and USGS on a project for black bear population monitoring using hair snares, and a large project where she'll help coordinate large teams of field researchers. So I'd like to thank the committee for being here. That's composed of Dr. Sarah Lennon from U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Dr. John Young from Texas Department of Transportation, and I'm also on the committee, Dr. Rick Klein from School of Earth, Environmental and Marine Sciences. So without further ado, thank you all for coming. She's going to be presenting on South Texas wildlife activity across a fragmented landscape and road mitigation corridor. Take it away.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Klein. Again, and before we get into talking about our South Texas wildlife activity, I would also like to thank each of my committee members, Dr. Klein, Dr. Young, and Dr. Lennon. They've been really supportive throughout this whole process. And so I'm going to go into a brief project introduction just to give you an idea of where we're going with all of this. Before getting into some background on road ecology and the study area. And then we'll launch right into the objectives of this study, and then the methods and analyses and results for each of those. It's going to be a 3-part analysis section. And then finally, we'll get into hopefully some discussion and time for questions at the end. So 8 of these wildlife crossing structures were installed under Farm to Market Road, or FM 106 in South Texas. And these were primarily to mitigate ocelot mortalities and mitigate habitat fragmentation for the greater wildlife community. Effects of this road and of its mitigation structures are not yet fully understood for ocelots and other species. And so the study design paired an analysis of roadside sites with habitat reference camera trap sites in order to evaluate mitigation structure performance, describe the extent of the road's effect, and then also to model wildlife activity throughout our study area. Roads here in the continental US make up just about 1% of our total landmass, but about 20% of that same area is located within just 150 meters of the road. So 1% may not seem like much, but the effects of roads can reach much farther, especially when you consider that 80% is located within just a kilometer of a given road. And so direct effects of roads, you were probably familiar with roadkill, for example, from wildlife vehicle collisions. There can also be some habitat degradation that occurs directly adjacent to the road. But those indirect effects can reach much farther. These can include things like altered community composition through species introductions, altered movement or behavioral patterns, which can affect trophic interactions, as different species may respond differently to disturbances like light or noise. And then, of course, habitat fragmentation is one of the biggest concerns here, which for sensitive populations over time may result in genetic isolation in the long term. And all of these things taken together can be called the road effect zone. Estimates of this zone in previous research have ranged from less than 300 to over 5 kilometers. So it really varies depending on what ecosystem you're looking at and what species you're studying. And so one of the first things that someone might do to try to prevent the direct effects of roads would be to install exclusion fencing or mitigation fencing, right? So this prevents mortalities by preventing wildlife from entering the road in the first place. But this may exacerbate habitat fragmentation by doubling down on that barrier effect of the road. So a lot of times we pair these with wildlife crossing structures. Those can look like a variety of different things depending on what species you're targeting. You can see an example of ours here in Texas on the top right. But basically, paired with that mitigation fencing, wildlife crossing structures can not only help to mitigate road mortalities, but may also improve habitat connectivity in the area. But this can only occur if these are successfully designed and placed in appropriate locations on the landscape. And determining if those are successful or not is kind of a tricky business, but it's really important that you think about how you go about this. Some previous studies have only looked at the use of these crossing structures, just counting up how many of your target species are crossing through the underpasses, for example. But this doesn't really account for a sort of baseline level of wildlife activity in the surrounding habitat. So instead, for this project, we focus on performance monitoring, which compares the actual use of the crossing structures with the expected use based on comparable habitat monitoring in the surrounding area. A similar way you could think about this, or an alternative way you could think about this, would be using a successful crossing rate or percent crossing rate, in which you say you define the number of crossings as compared to the number of total approaches that you detect for a certain species approaching a wildlife crossing structure. And so, as Dr. Klein mentioned, FM 106 is one of 2 major mitigation corridors that we've been monitoring on this overall project. On FM 106, over about 16 kilometers of roadway, we have 8 wildlife crossing structures, and these vary slightly in their dimensions and in the fence lengths adjacent to them and in their basic designs. But overall, these are all underpass structures, and they're all made of prefabricated concrete. And their primary goals, again, were to mitigate ocelot mortalities, as well as to reduce the barrier effect on the overall wildlife community. And so the ocelot, if you're not familiar, is a neotropical felid native throughout much of Central and South America. Historically, as you can see on the top left, it was actually native throughout much of Texas and the Gulf Coast. However, today, those populations are limited to less than 80 to 100 individuals, and those exist in 2 breeding populations, or at least 2 known breeding populations here in South Texas. There's one to the north in Willacy County, and then the one we'll be focusing on today is in Cameron County on the Laguna de Escosa National Wildlife Refuge. And so the major drivers of this range contraction in the US has been due to the destruction of their preferred thorn scrub habitat, particularly in Texas and the Rio Grande Valley. This has seen over 90% loss due to agricultural land use and development. In addition to that habitat loss, we also see habitat fragmentation being reinforced by increasing urbanization and road networks. And in just one long-term study, about 35% of known ocelot mortalities were due to wildlife vehicle collisions on the road. But of course, the ocelot is just one of dozens of species in the South Texas wildlife community, and many of these other species are likely experiencing similar pressures from increasing urbanization, agricultural development, or road networks. And so we study in this study, we focus on a much larger portion of the wildlife community. This list here is, as of this year at least, is all of the known species to have successfully used a wildlife crossing structure on either FM 106 or our adjacent road mitigation corridor. And if we focus in on species which we regularly detect using our camera traps, our potential target species, about half of those have been shown in previous work to associate closely with dense woody canopy cover. And within our study area, that typically looks like Tommeliten thorn scrub, as you can see here. And it's also highlighted in blue on the left. But that thorn scrub habitat is somewhat fragmented and restricted within our study area. In addition to that thorn scrub habitat, we also see about 30% of our study area made up of agricultural land use. In addition to FM 106, there are also a few residential roads and a few access driveways to facilities like the Laguna de Escosa headquarters or the Port Isabel Detention Center, which may also be affecting wildlife's ability to move freely across the landscape and access these remnant patches of thorn scrub. In addition to those, the remainder of our study area is made up of a mix of coastal prairie, savanna grasslands, and salt flat communities. Which on a good day looks something like this. And studying how wildlife are responding to and moving through these different plant communities or habitat types may be important for determining where we might be placing crossing structures or mitigation structures in future projects. So the primary objectives of this study were first to identify land cover characteristics that affect wildlife community composition across our study corridor. Second, to describe the road effect zone of FM 106 based off of not just wildlife detections, but also their relative activity up to 1 kilometer away from the roadway. And finally, to determine the performance, again, that's looking at expected versus actual use of our crossing structures and fencing structures on FM 106 for each of our target species. And again, so that objective 1 is looking at the broad wildlife community, basically as much as we can get from our camera trapping data. But then objectives 2 and 3, we focus in on 4 target species. So the first of those being the bobcat. This has been used in previous research as a sort of surrogate or proxy for ocelot detections. We didn't anticipate really having enough ocelot detections within our data set to conduct formal statistical analyses. And so the bobcat is used as potentially having a similar ecological role and similar potentially movement or behavior patterns. And then the coyote, the white-tailed deer, and our striped skunk made up our secondary target species for this project. So the study design in simplest terms really boils down to a comparison of roadside versus habitat reference sites. Those roadside sites are located here. You can see we have 8 around our wildlife crossing structures and fence end sites. And then in addition, we have 6 unmitigated right-of-way sites. So these were located in areas away from any sort of fencing or mitigation structure to get an idea of what wildlife activity looked like in the absence of these structures and identifying where they may be crossing the road at the surface of the road. That looked something like this with our camera setup at each of those sites. Crossing structures had 3 cameras pointed at each entrance, and then 1 camera pointed directly away into the surrounding habitat. At fence end sites, we had 2 cameras, 1 monitoring each of those pairs of fence end segments. And then at right-of-way sites, we also had a pair of cameras, 1 on each side of the road, pointed directly into the adjacent habitat. For our habitat study sites, I set up 36 camera trap sites monitoring up to 1 kilometer away from FM 106. The selection for these sites was limited somewhat to land that was managed by the Laguna de Escosa National Wildlife Refuge. Those are the areas highlighted in green to the left. And you can see our study sites in pink. And in order to thoroughly represent the thorn scrub habitat in particular, especially since this was often where our wildlife crossing structures were placed, we wanted to make sure to represent this as well as other habitat types throughout our study area. And so for this, I used a stratified random site selection process to determine the habitat reference sites. So it looks something like this, where we evenly selected from 3 different vegetation classes, those being open, mixed, and dense. And that's based on the percentage of canopy cover density at each of those sites. I also selected evenly across 3 distance bins, so increasing distance from the road with thresholds at 300 and 600 meters, and then evenly distributed between the east and west sides of the road. And in practice, that looked like this, where I used ArcGIS Pro to overlay a fishnet, a 50 by 50 grid over all of our available sites, and then defined at the center of each of those a 15-meter radius site, and then numbered each of those, randomly selected from those numbers, and evaluated those sites until all of the categories above were fulfilled evenly. And so once I had that list of sites, camera placement in the field looks something like this. I was using Reconyx Hyperfire 2 camera models. These were secured to powder-coated steel U-posts and then driven into the ground. So the cameras were sitting about 50 to 55 centimeters off the ground. We then cleared and maintained vegetation in about a 2.5 meter arc ahead of each camera and directly around each camera. And importantly, these were angled slightly towards the ground such that that detection zone, as you can see in the pink on the bottom right, was able to capture both small and large animals. And it actually sort of limited our detection zone so that we were not capturing more, for example, in one vegetation class than the other. So our detection zone was limited to about 3 or 4 meters ahead of each camera. And then finally, I conducted canopy cover surveys. I took 5 measurements around each camera and then averaged those to get a metric for the average canopy cover density of each of my camera sites. And this was used to also verify that the expected vegetation class matched what we were seeing on the ground. So all in all, the total camera array combined looks something like this. You might have noticed we have quite a few more roadside sites within this array. And a lot of that is because we have some of these redundant cameras monitoring our crossing structure entrances. So we have our video and trip cameras. And as useful as that information is for detecting behavior or crossing events, these were excluded from the habitat roadside comparison so that we weren't biasing towards these sites in a significant way. And so in order to create a balanced design and create sort of a 4th distance bin within that roadside area, I selected from our right-of-way sites and crossing structure adjacent sites to be able to compare with the habitat. And part of that was because each of these camera types was a standalone passive infrared camera, which was looking directly at vegetation rather than at any sort of crossing structure. And so that made them a little more directly comparable with our habitat sites. I eliminated any if they had inconsistent camera angles or any gaps in data due to flooding or other data collection issues. And then from within those remaining cameras, randomly selected 12 evenly distributed between those two site types and across our 3 vegetation classes. So for all of this data collection, we were using camera trapping, which is great for collecting non-invasive behavioral and detection footage. And we can gather that for multiple species at the same time to be able to collect across a large portion of the wildlife community. This makes them especially resource efficient as far as time and cost goes for community analyses. And these are especially well suited for medium to large mammals. The passive infrared mechanism in each of these cameras is detecting changes in radiated heat. So this works consistently well with warm-blooded animals. And then these also work especially well if you're doing comparative studies with like relative detection data, which is essentially what we have set up here with our control impact or our habitat versus road sites. And so once we have all of our data collected from our cameras, we end up with thousands and thousands of photos to process, which we use a few key pieces of software to go about. First, we automatically rename all of our photos based on the date and time at which they were collected. We then, with the help of lots of awesome undergraduate technicians, sort our files by the species identified and number of individuals observed in each photo. We then use data organize to basically turn that file structure information into text format, which I can then use to run through an R script, which helps me to define detection events. So for instance, rather than in this case counting 4 detections of a Virginia opossum occurring just a few seconds apart, we say, okay, that's probably the same individual. We're going to group all those 4 detections into a single detection event. And I use a 30-minute buffer window on either side of those detection events. And that's sort of the basis of our assumption of independence between detections. And these detection events are the primary response variable that we'll be looking at in the analyses today. This is also important because this allows us to compare across these 2 habitat and roadside arrays, even when we are getting slightly more photos taken with the roadside cameras. Those took 3 photos per trigger versus 1 in the habitat. But because we're looking at detection events, that redundant information kind of all comes out in the wash. And so we can get a 1-to-1 comparison for community composition and target species activity. But we do use that additional footage at the roadside, at the crossing structure sites, to be able to define crossing interactions or essentially different behavioral classifications, particularly crossings, non-crossings. And then we also flagged any potential predator-prey interactions or predation events actually occurring at these, as well as our habitat sites. And just to give you an example here of a crossing event that looks something like this, where we have our ocelot approaching on the east side of our structure, and then exiting to the west just a few moments later. Here we have just one example of what non-crossing behavior might look like, where we see our ocelot approach crossing structure 3, look around, check for gators in the water, and decides not to cross and walks away. And then here we have a really great example of a predation event occurring, where we have a bobcat crouched just ahead of our camera, pounces into the grass, and it looks like comes up with a pretty good sized rodent here for dinner. So all in all, this data collection period took place between July of 2021 through May of 2022. This was for a total of about 10 months or 300 camera trap nights per site. And for a variety of reasons, some of those cameras were fully operational for longer than others. And so all of our detection data was adjusted to about 100 camera trap nights to account for those gaps in camera operation. In addition to that detection data, I also quantified vegetation and landscape variables as potential predictors of wildlife behavior and movement. And so launching right into our first analysis, this was again focusing on broad patterns across the wildlife community. I first wanted to test how vegetation class and then also distance bins might be affecting the wildlife community. For this, I used a permanova or permutational multivariate analysis of variance with the predictions that there would be distinct wildlife communities across each of those vegetation classes and distance bins. And then I used an ANOVA or analysis of variance to test whether species richness would increase with increased canopy cover density and distance to the road. So the results of that permanova look something like this. With these plots, basically, the more separation you see between these groups, that's likely indicating that you're seeing a distinct wildlife community across each of those groups. And so we saw support for hypothesis 1. We did see distinct wildlife communities across open, mixed, and dense vegetation classes. And we did see some support for hypothesis 2. We saw that there was a distinct community at the roadside as compared to our habitat sites. But we really didn't see any separation within those 3 distance bins within our habitat classes. Similarly, for our species richness analysis, we saw that species richness did increase with increasing canopy cover up to a point. We saw that mixed and dense classes saw significantly higher species richness metrics. But this was not supported for the second part of this hypothesis, as we really didn't see any difference in species richness across our 4 distance bins. For analysis 2, this was looking at the overall road effect zone. And so the first part of this, I focused on the spatial distribution of bobcats specifically. And then for hypotheses 6 and 7, the second part, I focused on temporal or dial activity patterns for our primary as well as our secondary target species. So again, that was bobcats, coyotes, white-tailed deer, and skunks. And for that first part, again, for looking at bobcat detections, I used a generalized linear model to look at possible predictors of this spatial distribution. And then for the target species dial activity analysis, I used 2 R packages called activity and overlap to develop circular probability distribution functions, which we were then able to quantify and test these hypotheses with. So the predictions here were first that bobcats would be increasing with increased distance to the road. And then that bobcats would also be increasing with increased woody canopy cover between each site and the road, with the idea that this is testing to see if woody cover is potentially buffering any negative effects of the road for this species. And then for hypothesis 6, we first wanted to test whether we were seeing significantly distinct dial activity patterns for our target species at the roadside versus the habitat. And then as a follow-up, we predicted that we would see significantly less overlap with traffic activity at roadside sites as compared to habitat sites. Essentially that target species occurring at the roadside would do so during times when traffic was lowest, which potentially indicating that they're exhibiting some sort of temporal avoidance due to traffic. So for that generalized linear model, I used a negative binomial distribution family to model that detection data. And this included 7 main and 2 interaction terms. This was looking at different metrics of woody canopy cover availability across the corridor, as well as distance to nearest water sources, distance to FM 106 and secondary roads. And then finally, the interaction to test that second hypothesis, the interaction of distance to road and woody canopy cover. And so the results of that analysis look something like this. We saw that these 4 factors were significant not only in the top model, but in our top 10 models pretty consistently. These were ranked based on AIC score. We really only saw one that was competitive with less than 2 delta AIC score. And this best model, including those four significant factors, had an R-squared value of about 0.48. So it's likely that this model explains about half of the variation that we're seeing in this data set. And so those 4 factors were first, percent of woody canopy cover. This had a positive effect on bobcat detections across our study area. And then distance to woody cover, distance to FM 106, and the amount of woody cover between each site and roadway transect each had a slight but negative effect on bobcat detections for our camera trap array. So this meant that hypothesis 4 and 5 were not at all supported. We had predicted the opposite of this, but what we actually saw was that bobcats may actually be occurring more frequently on our camera trap array as you get closer to FM 106, and actually as you have less cover between each site and roadway. Moving on to the second part of this analysis, this focused on our dial activity patterns, which plotted across most of the wildlife community here. You can see looks something like this. I have highlighted ocelots, for example, which, like many other smaller mesocarnivore species, have a pretty strictly nocturnal activity pattern. Bobcats, on the other hand, are distributed somewhat more evenly throughout the day, with possible kind of crepuscular spikes at dawn and dusk. And then white-tailed deer, for example, driving this large ungulate curve in the background in green, have a very clearly crepuscular activity pattern with those spikes at dawn and dusk. And just for reference, so we're all on the same page, we'll be looking at a lot of graphs like this, where they're centered on 12 noon. You can see midnight represented on the far left and far right. And so these are mapping how our target species are behaving over the course of a day-night cycle. I have those, and those vertical markers are for approximate sunrise and sunset times, just for reference. But so our first test here was to see whether or not the activity seen for each target species at the roadside sites was significantly distinct from the distribution seen at the habitat sites. So shown in pink and green respectively here. And then that follow-up test was to see if this was potentially driven by traffic activity. So we had the prediction that roadside overlap with traffic activity would be much lower than the habitat overlap with traffic activity. So essentially what that looks like is we would be seeing shifts towards more nocturnal behavior or more nocturnal activity at these roadside sites, as wildlife may be trying to avoid times of high traffic activity. All right, and so what those results actually looked like, for bobcats at least, we saw a significant difference between those roadside versus habitat activity patterns. But we did not necessarily see that shift was significantly towards more nocturnal behavior. We did see that there was more overlap with the habitat activity versus traffic activity, but this was a fairly slight effect. So for coyotes, on the other hand, we saw both significance for the distinction between these two activity curves, and then we also saw that there was a distinct shift with lower overlap with traffic with the roadside sites as compared to traffic with the habitat sites. So you can start to see that here, where we're seeing potentially more nocturnal activity occurring for coyotes at the roadside sites. And then for white-tailed deer, this is perhaps when we see it this effect the strongest. we saw that these were significantly distinct curves. And then also that white-tailed deer actually maybe even change from crepuscular behavior in sort of our habitat control group to almost a more nocturnal pattern here in the roadside. And this delta overlap is essentially indicating the degree to which we're seeing that shift towards more nocturnal behavior. And finally, looking at striped skunks, these had no significant results across the board. And that may be a factor of, or maybe it may just be the fact that this is a nocturnal species to begin with, which may not be encountering those times of high traffic activity to begin with. So they did not seem to have distinct activity patterns, and the overlap between road and habitat versus traffic did not seem to change. So overall, we saw support for hypothesis 6 that roadside versus habitat activity was significantly different for each of our target species. We saw that for bobcats, coyotes, and white-tailed deer. And then for hypothesis 7, we saw that shift towards more nocturnal behavior for coyotes and white-tailed deer specifically. And we're not going to get all the way into every facet of this just for the sake of time today, but we do start to see from all the data that we've reviewed so far, we start to see some patterns emerging. So mesocarnivore species in particular, as we just saw, they may be showing some temporal avoidance of the road, at least for our coyotes, raccoons, and potentially opossum. But these shifts are much slighter than we see for ungulates, for example. But then mesocarnivores actually seem to be detected more often in the roadside sites as compared to the average detections at habitat sites. And you see kind of the opposite occurring for ungulates, which seem to be, well, with the exception of javelina, seem to be avoiding the road spatially as well as temporally. So moving right into analysis 3 out of 3, almost there. We wanted to look at, again, the performance of our different mitigation structures. And so first we focused on our wildlife crossing structures with the prediction that performance differentials would be positive for all of these sites, indicating that they're used more often than comparable habitat sites and are likely successfully providing habitat connectivity throughout this area. Hypothesis 9 focused on fence-end sites and was similar but kind of flipped, right? We wanted to see negative performance differentials across all of these fence-end sites, indicating that they're used somewhat less often than comparable habitat sites, and maybe effectively preventing or redirecting wildlife out of the roadway. And then for hypothesis 10, this looked at the kind of widely cited prey trap hypothesis from road ecology literature, with the prediction actually that predation events would not be occurring more frequently at mitigation sites as compared to habitat or right-of-way sites. So the results of our crossing structure performance look something like this. We're just going to focus in on those target species for today. But this essentially gave us some partial support for hypothesis 8. We see a lot of positive performance differentials. Basically anything not highlighted in red was positive or high. We saw that for bobcats, coyotes, and striped skunks at quite a few sites. The exceptions were white-tailed deer, which had negative performance scores across the board, which could be for a few different reasons that we'll talk about in a second. But we also saw a few sites that we kind of flagged as concerning. So crossing structure 2 had negative scores for coyotes and relatively low scores for bobcats. And then crossing structure 3 had negative performance across the board for all species except for northern raccoon. Looking at fence-end performance, this is again sort of flipped where we want to be seeing negative or not particularly high scores. And looking at each of our target species, we see that actually white-tailed deer this time are performing as expected at all of these sites. But then we are seeing really high activity levels occurring at some of our fence ends, kind of in different areas for different target species. which leaves us to question, when should we really be concerned about these? Like, which ones should we focus on? And to go about addressing that, I looked at a side-by-side comparison of all of our, and we're just going to focus on bobcats for today, but looking at our wildlife crossing structure performance scores versus our fence end performance scores, and keeping an eye out for any areas where we see particularly low or negative crossing structure scores, paired with particularly high activity indices shown at our fence ends. So potentially looking at areas where wildlife are refusing to use the crossing structure and are instead going around to the end of the fence end to cross at the road or travel along the right of way. And we saw this in two areas. So for crossing structure 3, anybody who's worked on this project probably knows why that's happening. This site was dry for a long time, but throughout the course of this study period, at least within this 10 months, it was almost always inundated with standing or flowing water, which may not be a problem for species like the raccoon. As we said, that one had the only positive performance scores for this site. But there's a lot of well-documented previous studies showing that water or flooding may be a deterrent to crossing at these structures for species like bobcats or ocelots. Crossing structure 2 was a little bit trickier to potentially explain. We saw those low scores for bobcats at the crossing structure, but then high activity at some of our fence end sites. And crossing structure 2 kind of stood out for a variety of reasons. It was one of our tallest structures and had one of the highest openness ratios, but it also had this wide gap between, there's a large distance between the crossing structure entrance and the nearest vegetation cover. And it's not really located in a clear corridor. It's kind of located between these two patches of thorn scrub. And so there may be something to be said for wildlife are simply not being funneled to this particular crossing point. It seems equally advantageous for them to cross around the north fence end, for example. But we would really need to see more replication of these conditions to be able to say for sure which ones of these are affecting these performance scores. As part of this analysis, I also looked at how performance differentials compare to our more traditional metric for looking at crossing structure success, which is crossing rate. And this actually comparably worked pretty well for most of our species groups, with possibly the exception of the coyote, which showed a lot of variation for crossing rate, but not a lot of variation for performance differentials. So this could speak to the fact that if you don't already know a lot about the habitat preferences for your target species on a project like this, performance differentials might be giving you a better or more in-depth idea of what that might look like. And then finally, for that final hypothesis, looking at predation events at control versus mitigation sites, we saw confirmed predation events occurring for bobcats, domestic cats, and Virginia opossum. We saw, I think in total that it added up to about 20 of these events. So this is a small sample size to be pulling information from. And we saw that if you look at just the raw numbers, you do see more predation events in total occurring at our crossing structure sites. But again, those also have a lot more camera traps set up and include both sides of the site. So after you weighted for the total number of detections and the total amount of camera trap effort at each of these groups, we saw in this last column that the frequency of predation events was actually highest in habitat sites compared to any of these other 3 groups. So in all, this gave us, at least from this data set, no evidence to contribute to that prey trap hypothesis. All right, so what did we learn today? For analysis 1, I think the biggest takeaway is that vegetation structure is hugely important for this kind of study and should be incorporated into any sort of future analyses of crossing structure performance or habitat connectivity. The road effect zone, at least within the community that we were able to document, seems limited to the area directly adjacent to FM 106, so within about 20 meters. And this may be a result of the fact that FM 106 has been present on this landscape for over, I believe, 30 years, in which time the wildlife community may have shifted or habituated to its presence. From analysis 2, we saw that our target species, the bobcat, increased with increased woody cover availability and with increased proximity to FM 106, which was surprising, but not completely out of the blue. We saw that large ungulates show some spatial avoidance as well as temporal avoidance of the road. And we saw that mesocarnivores actually show some spatial attractants to the road, including our bobcats. And so this may be due to their use of these sites for scavenging as travel corridors or as boundaries between home ranges, as has been seen in previous research. And finally, 3 of our 4 target species were likely affected by traffic on 106, and 2 of them shifted towards that more nocturnal behavior at roadside sites. All right, and then for analysis 3, we saw that our crossing structure sites 2 and 3 may be underperforming for some of our target species for those reasons we already talked about. But overall, wildlife crossing structures seem to be performing really well for mesocarnivores or smaller mammals, but maybe not so much for larger bodied ungulates. And this may have to do with their size. They may be able to fit through almost all of these structures, but it would be a tight squeeze at some sites. And there may also be longer habituation time requirements for these species, as they take more time to potentially get used to using these as crossing points between parts of their home ranges. We saw that performance differentials were fairly well correlated with our percent success or crossing rates. And we saw no evidence here of any sort of prey trap occurring at our mitigation sites. All right, and as comprehensive as our study efforts have been here, I think it's important to note that this is still only a 10-month snapshot of larger trajectories in the ecological community, and we're only looking at a limited portion of the wildlife community. Notably, certain carnivore species such as the jaguar and jaguarundi have been extirpated from the Rio Grande Valley over the past 80 years. Other species such as our ocelot, as well as the puma, badger, or long-tailed weasel, have been detected in these areas, but are detected at such low rates and may just have low population densities in some areas, such that we are essentially unable to incorporate these into a lot of our hypothesis testing or target species analysis. And the absence of these larger predators or competitive mesocarnivores may be affecting the remainder of the wildlife community as far as their behavior, abundance, or the community composition. And then finally, if we're looking at cryptic or cold-blooded species, these were likely under-detected or not at all detected by our current camera trapping array. So you may need improved future methods to be able to capture, for example, herpetofauna species along this study area. So as future studies are done in the growing number of wildlife crossing structure corridors and habitat connectivity projects throughout South Texas, it's certainly worth considering expanding the scope of our methods to be able to better incorporate these less common species. All right, and with that, I would again like to thank my thesis committee, Drs. Klein, Young, and Lennon. I also want to thank the Texas Department of Transportation, particularly Robin Gelston with the FAR District, for their continued support and funding. I'd also like to thank the Laguneras Costa National Wildlife Refuge for allowing us land access for all of this camera trapping. And then, of course, all of the much appreciated fieldwork and moral support from all of the members of the Klein Lab. And with that, I'll open it up to any questions or discussion. Y'all still awake?
Oh, yes. Great job, Caitlin. Some applause, some virtual applause.
I love the virtual applause.
I didn't know anything about virtual applause before COVID.
The most important thing I learned from COVID grad school.
All right, so any questions from the audience?
Nope. Maybe some in the chat. Oh, no, okay.
Yeah, comment.
Thanks, Anna.
Hey, Caitlin, I have a question.
Hey,
Can you hear me?
Tom. Yeah, a little quiet, but yeah.
Okay. When you were looking at the distance effects of your road, did you look at all at how, like, species accumulation curves to look at, say, how many as a method of how many species or how many individuals there are of each species within each distance band?
Yeah,
To
so
see if there's any distinction there, like there's more individuals in one group rather than just species community composition.
yeah, no, that's a good question. Because yeah, richness, you're really collapsing it down. And if you do have some species that prefer the road and some that prefer the habitat, it all kind of washes out. We did look at species accumulation curves. I looked specifically at the 3 different vegetation classes, but I don't think I actually looked at the distance bins. So that could be definitely worth looking into. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
And Caitlin, I guess you didn't include that in your slide for sake of time, but what did you find with those species accumulation curves?
Yeah, I think we saw that we hit about 90% of our community represented after. It was just 3 weeks for dense sites. It took about 13 weeks for our open sites. But yeah, all of our cameras were out for 30 or 40 weeks, I think, and all. So yeah, at least across vegetation, I think we were getting a good sample of the community with all the camera trapping we did.
So Caitlin, you've done a lot of work here. Where would you hope to publish your work like this?
Like what?
Ideas? Yeah, what kind of journals or where do you aspire to publish?
I had been considering the Journal of Wildlife Management for a while now. Definitely open to others if you have suggestions, but yeah. And then of course, I mean, we report all this information. I mean, as you know, we report all this to the Texas Department of Transportation. And hopefully from that, they can make some conclusions of their own about future mitigation structures in the area.
So I have a question. Do you think monitoring should incorporate more than just looking at use of the wildlife crossing structures and actually look at what you did, these different distances further away from the road?
Yeah, so I think especially if it hasn't been done to that extent yet in a certain study area, I think it's certainly worth it. We did see again that those performance differentials are correlated pretty well with those percent crossing rates, which could be done. Those percentage of crossing rates could be done with just our roadside array if we're looking at crossings versus approaches to right up to the crossing structure. But I think, yeah, if you don't know much about the area or don't know much about certain target species or the habitat they prefer, I think that the performance differentials give you a much better idea. And as we saw here, you can also extract a lot of other data from that wider camera trapping effort. I think sometimes that you might miss from just having the roadside array. I think it could be done with a much shorter time period than we had our cameras out for, though. As we said, with the species accumulation that occurred within across any of our sites within a few months. So introducing maybe like a rotated camera trap array to sample across a wider area in a shorter period of time might be the best strategy to take away from that.
I have one more question, sort of
Yeah, sure.
related to that. Do you think that you could calculate performance differentials if you only had data for a very limited amount of time in your habitat? Like, do you think that it would be reasonable to calculate performance differentials for, say, crossing rates a year after you stopped collecting data in the habitat?
Oh, for a year after you stop collecting data.
Or do you think that it's only valid during the time that you're collecting data in the habitat? For
Yeah,
example,
no,
like
that's a
on
good-
1847,
Yeah, like if you could apply past data or adjacent data to, yeah, I think actually, and I can probably send you this too if you're interested specifically. I looked at a comparison of at least the kind of the habitat selection breakdown between those vegetation classes for FM106 versus our adjacent road corridor, SH100. And so for species where you're seeing like consistent results, I think it could be applicable to apply performance differentials collected maybe in the same time window, but to a different area. That might work well. But I think it maybe depends on how often your target species is going through, population cycles. I think we saw with Greta Schmidt's work that the crossing rates for bobcats, for example, were correlated with the relative abundance of bobcats in the area. But I think if you were shifting what time period you're looking at, you might run into possibly some issues there. But yeah, I don't know for sure.
All right, cool, thanks.
Yeah.
So just curiosity, if you were able to come back and look, what frequency would you think we should be coming back to look at performance differentials at? 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, 25 years? Any thoughts on that?
Obviously don't quote me on this, but I think maybe every 5 years or so might be appropriate. I think previous literature on like wildlife crossing structures and ungulates, I think they took at least 4 or 5 years before you saw that habituation occurring. So the crossing structures at FM106, as you know, are only a few years old. So it could be that we start to see ungulate use of these structures after that threshold or farther out into the future as they get more used to them. Yeah, it might be different for other species, but yeah, perhaps every 5 years would be a appropriate follow-up period.
Of these structures that you monitor, these especially on 106, how many of those were even capable of passing large ungulates size-wise?
Yeah. So I didn't check for nilgai, which are quite a bit larger than white-tailed deer. But when I looked at the white-tailed deer, body size, average dimensions versus our crossing structures, and just, from seeing all of our camera trap photos, I think they could fit through, let's see, I'd say at least 4 or 5 of our crossing structures, if not super comfortably, then potentially with some squeezing or head ducking. But we did see
on 106 or on 100 or on both?
Just on 106. On 100, we've seen them crossing at I know at least at crossing structure 3, which is that open span bridge. But on FM106, we only have seen them so far for white-tailed deer crossing at crossing structure 2, which is that tall one that I showed pictures of at the end there. But yeah, I think they could potentially fit through. Yeah, crossing 6, 7, 2, possibly 4 and 5. But yeah, I think it's just a matter of them being comfortable with that to happen.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
So Caitlin, had that one crossing structure not been flooded, what do you think would have happened to your numbers?
Yeah, so I think that structure is kind of weird. It's disappointing it was flooded for almost this entire study period, because we could have seen that drop-off point potentially when it did start flooding. Earlier in our overall project data collection, it had been periodically dry, at least more often than it was flooded. And we did see use by, let's see, certainly by bobcats, definitely by skunks and raccoons, a lot of our smaller mesocarnivores. We only had one approach. I think I showed it as the example of a crossing refusal. We only had one approach, I think, by an ocelot, where, and unfortunately during that time it was fully flooded. So yeah, I think we would have seen, you know, I think you still would have seen lower scores just because of that periodic flooding. But I think wildlife were certainly using it before it became flooded all the time. So we would have seen slightly higher scores, I think, for our mesocarnivores.
So I know you talked about this in your thesis, I wanted you to, for the broader audience, to talk about this too a little bit. And that is, what are your thoughts of this concept of utilizing existing structures that may be really designed to function for other things like water movement as wildlife crossings? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so yeah, as much as we talk about crossing structure 3 as a bad example of that that dual purpose crossing structure and drainage ditch, I think one of our most successful crossings, crossing structure 6, is also a dual purpose. It's located in a drainage area. For that one, it experiences periodic flooding, but usually that flooding goes down within a few days or weeks. And those catwalk structures, those little ledges on the side of the concrete structures, at crossing 6, I think those are almost always dry and available for use, whereas at crossing structure 3, there's been a lot of sediment infill that has basically made those useless for wildlife. So even when it's flooded, they're not able to find any sort of route of dry passage. So we really see two sides of the same coin, where this could be really effective to have these drainage ditches serve as wildlife crossings in some areas, as long as that flooding is not, you know, the norm. I think once wildlife start to see that it's flooded all the time, they may stop revisiting that site in the long term. And so, yeah, I think that's a big issue of concern for crossing structure 3, but at other sites, it's worked well as long as those sites are able to drain.
All right, any more brave audience members that want to ask a question?
I can just show you more camera trap photos.
So, Caitlin, I have one last one. It's a little off topic, I think, but
Okay.
so the ocelot was that was killed on the road. I guess it was on a side road from here.
Yeah.
You have from your study, do you have any insight as to how much animal traffic there was in that area? Is that a popular area for all types of wildlife, bobcats and otherwise?
Yeah. You mean that crossing structure or that road?
Yeah, that crossing structure and the surrounding habitat to that.
Yeah, I think, let me find a map just to for people who are less familiar. But yeah, so one of our ocelot individuals was hit and killed by a car after, you know, really consistently using these crossing structures. He was using 2 sites over and over again for a period of, I think, about 5 months. And he got hit on that access drive out to the Port Isabel Detention Center. There's a map here soon. Okay. Yeah, so can you guys see my cursor at all or no?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So that road is located right about here. And then this is crossing structure 6, almost right where that road meets FM 106. So we were seeing this ocelot individual crossing here at crossing 6 and at crossing 7 down here. So really using throughout this area. But then he got hit on the road over leading out to that detention center. Yeah, and so I think this is definitely one of the areas of higher crossing structure performance. And with the habitat camera sites I had, these were also I just from memory, not quoting me on any specific stats, but these were really high activity areas. Even at this site way out here, this drainage ditch is like clearly a trail for wildlife activity. So yeah, and that may be another area for potentially reconfiguring the fencing. I know we had talked about that with TxDOT for a minute there, when we saw that the ocelot individual had been going around the end of that fence structure in that area. But yeah, otherwise it's hard to say whether that would affect other species in the same way, or if it was just that one ocelot. I don't know. Yeah, and the fencing near the prison and the detention centers, I know hard to manage where those fence ends link up with our fencing versus their fencing, but yeah, that's definitely another area of concern, I think.
And you were limited to setting your cameras on the public property or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service property. I know after that they had acquired more property, I think, in that area.
Yeah, so like this, if you can see, yeah, the cursor kind of outlining, I think this entire Delaney Farms property parcel was acquired midway through this project, maybe. And I know some of that is slated for thorn scrub restoration. Some of it's more focused on the coastal prairie restoration. But yeah, that could have implications for how wildlife are moving between these patches of thorn scrub.
What are your thoughts on that right there? That coastal prairie restoration versus ocelot, are they mutually exclusive? Are they compatible? And folks who don't understand, the coastal prairie restoration initiative is for another endangered species, an Aplomato falcon, that also co-resides in this area with the ocelot.
Yeah, I think my understanding, at least, of how Fish and Wildlife decided to slate those areas for the coastal prairie management was really based on soil conditions and where thorn scrub could be supported in the long term. I think it was decided that some of those areas would be better managed for the coastal prairie, but they did leave. I think I broadly highlighted where that management plan is taking place in orange here, or red here. But they did, I think, intentionally leave a lot of those, the edges of corridors, for example, or edges of drainage ditches, where there is maybe that higher water access area to be slated for thorn scrub restoration specifically. So yeah, I think those things are potentially compatible, but as I'm sure you know, thorn scrub takes a long time to grow and mature. So I definitely think that could be prioritized as a long-term project. Yeah.
And I'm not calling anybody out on anything. I just want to point out the difficulty of managing for this species, endangered species, with roads and competing management issues and everything else. That's all.
Yeah, that's a lot to juggle.
All right, any more questions from the audience? Okay, well, I'd like to thank you all for coming. Caitlin did a great job. Give her one last virtual applause, and we will ask the audience to sign off so that we might ask Caitlin some more detailed questions.
Thanks,
Thank you very much.
Great job, Caitlin. Also, Croatia won on PKs. You're welcome.
Spoilers, Jamie.